I replaced the St. Louis Rams in Madden 07 with my own custom team, the Albuquerque Vipers, and in recent months the team has gained a lot more fans, but to get fully caught up, one has to watch over 60 hours of videos, and who's got time for that? So instead, I made this video to summarize the first 11 seasons of the franchise. As a cupcake team in year one, it was a rough go for the Vipers. We became the first team in NFL history to finish 0-16, joining the 1976 Tampa Bay Buccaneers in the winless season club. Going into week 17, we had one last chance for a win. Instead, we suffered one of the worst losses in NFL history, which we would never forget. We did have a few bright spots though, including somewhat of a revival for Cordell Stewart's career after he took over for the struggling quarterback Dave Douglas. But the brightest spot on the whole team was 69 overall wide receiver Glenn Nash, who finished with nearly 1,000 yards and 5 touchdowns, becoming a fan favorite. The 2006 season finished very similar to real life, with LaDainian Tomlinson winning the MVP, the exact same results with the exact same teams on Championship Sunday, and of course, the exact same Super Bowl. The only difference being Peyton Manning throwing 5 interceptions in the big game and the Bears winning their second Lombardi trophy. The offseason started with us firing Scott Linehan and bringing in Super Bowl champion Brian Billick as our next head coach. We ended up using the franchise tag on kicker Martin Gramatica, who was great for us in season 1, only missing 1 field goal. He wanted to play for a winning team. He was going to be sticking around here for at least 1 more year though. We tried to sign some big names in free agency, but obviously we weren't the most attractive destination for players to go to. But with all the cap room we had, not everyone could say no to the Vipers. Now, of course, we wound up with the first overall pick in the draft, and we had a decision to make. Shannon Pleasant was mocked as the best quarterback in the draft, but there were 5 projected to go in the first round. We narrowed down our selection to 2 players, Washington State's Shannon Pleasant or Kentucky's Orlando Cross. Despite everyone around the organization wanting Pleasant, we ended up taking a flyer on Orlando Cross. We also traded back into the first round, taking tackle Lorenzo Perry to protect our now hopeful quarterback of the future. With that trade happening, our next pick wasn't until the 4th round, where Washington's Charles Phillips caught my eye. Orlando Cross entered the building as an 84 overall, not bad at all for a rookie, and both Perry and Phillips were a 78 overall. Shannon Pleasant was drafted 7th overall by the Houston Texans. He was an 85 overall. 3 other quarterbacks were taken in the first round. Dwayne Kent by the Eagles, Dunkta Koch went to Carolina, and John Owens was taken by Seattle. But we weren't done yet, as we grabbed a handful of starters in the second wave of free agency. Orlando Cross was leading the Vipers on a nice opening drive in his first NFL game before he made his first big mistake, being picked off by Kraft. But Michael Bennett had a big debut game, running for over 100 yards and a score. The defense did their job, shutting down Drew Brees and company, and in the 4th quarter, Orlando Cross threw a dot to Drew Bennett for his first career touchdown, which led to our first win in franchise history. The next week, we hosted the Tampa Bay Buccaneers in the Toilet Bowl, as we had a combined 3 wins last season. In this game, Orlando Cross would suffer his first of what would become many injuries in his NFL career. Josh McCown would step in and throw a touchdown late in the 4th to make it a 7-point game, and we got one of our only successful onside kicks in franchise history, but unfortunately the offense couldn't do anything with it. 2 losses later, and we fell to 1-3. In week 5, we had a matchup of rookies, Cross versus Koch. After battling back and forth, Cross would throw a dot to Glenn Nash with less than a minute to go, but that was plenty of time for Dunkta Koch, who led a game-winning drive that dropped us to 1-4. After our bye week, we played the Ravens, who were one of the best teams in the NFL. We were able to take advantage of Kyle Buller being in the game for an injured Air McNair, and we were able to pull off a huge upset for our 2nd win ever. Unfortunately, the winning didn't continue on Sunday night against Detroit. We hosted the Cincinnati Bengals the following week, which wound up being our first ever overtime game, and we got the victory. A week later, we beat the Cardinals, and we started to feel good about ourselves, but could we take down the mighty Seahawks? The answer was no, and to make matters worse, Cross would be out for the next 3 weeks with broken ribs. But maybe that's what this team needed, because Josh McCown was slinging it against the lowly 49ers in a 4-touchdown performance, followed by us upsetting Michael Vick's Falcons, and then tossing this game winner against the Arizona Cardinals. But even on a 3-game winning streak, Coach Billick chose to play Cross in a huge game against Seattle. They took a 3-score lead on us, and once the offense finally got hot, it was too late for us. Cross would start again against the Steelers the next week in a game where Ike Taylor got his revenge against his former team. We kept having to chase the Steelers score though, and ended up falling 38-35 in a wild one, which knocked us out of playoff contention. We finished 2007 with an 8-8 record, a huge improvement from 0-16. Orlando Cross showed flashes of greatness, but he also had plenty of struggles, throwing 21 touchdowns to 25 interceptions. Michael Bennett was a nice surprise for us, rushing for over 1,000 yards and 5 scores, and Cross was able to show off his mobility as well. And the rookie Charles Phillips had over 1,000 yards on just 32 receptions, which is wild. He ended up winning Rookie of the Year ahead of Orlando Cross and Shannon Pleasant. In the Super Bowl, Indianapolis was back and they were ready to win it this time, but the Eagles were also there and they picked off Manning 3 times, winning the game 10-7, bringing home their first Lombardi trophy. To kick off the 2008 offseason, we signed restricted free agent Alex Smith, the tight end, not the quarterback. We also gave star cornerback Ike Taylor a new deal as he was holding out. Despite us winning 8 games last year, Martin Gramatica still wanted nothing to do with us, so we granted his wish and let him go. We continued to improve the team in free agency, bringing in Matt Lear, Dre Bly, and a couple of hauls for special teams. There was a big free agent we couldn't get though, as future Hall of Famer Julius Peppers signed with the Ravens over us. They also grabbed Jerry Porter, as if that defense wasn't already scary enough. After trading, we once again had 2 first-round picks, and we got players for the middle of both of the offensive and defensive lines in Chris Diamond and Daryl Fannin, and they're both going to be day 1 starters for us. In the second wave of free agency, I noticed the Patriots didn't sign their first-round pick, running back Phil Van Dyke, so we happily picked him up, and he was a heck of a lot cheaper than he would have been on that rookie contract. After making that move, our running back Michael Robinson demanded a trade, so we fleeced the Seahawks for a 3rd-round pick. The Vipers started off their 3rd season 2-0, and it felt like Cross was making a second-year leap, but he still had some room to grow as he couldn't come up clutch against the Buccaneers. And then he suffered an injury early the next week against Buffalo, which sidelined him for the next 4 weeks. Luckily, the defense came up clutch, picking off rookie quarterback Andre Bennett 3 times. After losing a close one against Chicago, we had to play the undefeated Seahawks. We did just enough to force overtime, and Michael Bennett called the game with this great run. Riding high after that win, we dominated the winless 49ers the next week, with Dre Bly picking off Alex Smith 4 times, tying an NFL record. Orlando Cross came back from his injury just in time for a Monday night matchup with the New England Patriots. He had another chance at a game-winning drive, but again, he couldn't come up clutch and we dropped our 3rd game. After Cross threw another late interception, this one coming against Arizona, we had our 2nd matchup against the Seahawks. And this time, Cross was able to come up clutch in the end, finding Phillips deep at the end of the game. In Week 12, we hosted the defending Super Bowl champion Philadelphia Eagles, and this game showed us that we weren't quite yet a top-tier team. Our schedule didn't get any easier though, as we played the 8-3 Giants next, and we showed that we were at least worthy of a playoff spot, winning 33-21. We took care of business against the Jets, but the 4-win Redskins gave us issues, and it took overtime for us to beat them. We continued to struggle against bad teams, losing this trap game against San Francisco. Fighting for a playoff spot in Week 17, we played in what now is known as the Turnover Fest game, where the Vipers and Cowboys took turns committing turnovers on 5 straight drives, with Albuquerque making the most out of it. Michael Vick won the MVP, and Orlando Cross, Charles Phillips, Dre Bly, and John Hall were all honorable mentions for awards at their respective positions. At 10-6, we finally made our postseason debut, and it was against the Seattle Seahawks, who we swept in the regular season. But this was new territory for us and not so much for them, and they had their way with us. The Colts couldn't lose the Super Bowl this year though, as they didn't make it there. Instead, it was a rematch of Super Bowl 31 between the Packers and the Patriots. Aaron Rodgers had to leave the game early with an injury, but his backup Joe Brady kept the game close. Ultimately, the Patriots would win their 4th Super Bowl title in what became known as the Brady Bowl. One thing we still really needed to improve was our offensive line, and former first-round pick Lorenzo Perry wasn't cutting it, allowing 25 sacks in 2 years. While I normally like to give players at least 3 years, the protection had to improve, so we traded him to the Detroit Lions where he could win a starting job. We replaced him with Tariq Glenn, one of the best left tackles in football. Opposite him, we brought in Jordan Gross to really shore up our offensive line, and on defense, we signed James Hall. Some notable signings across the league include Randy Moss to the Giants and Ty Law to the Saints. We went defense with our first 2 picks of the draft, selecting safety John Kelly and defensive end Antrell Wilson, and in the 4th round we got another speedy wide receiver in Chris Clark. The New Orleans Saints selected a quarterback in the 1st round, and they ended up cutting Drew Brees afterwards, and apparently nobody wanted him as he was still available after the 2nd free agency wave. There were also still some notable running backs on the open market, including Edgerrin James and Ed Ailman, who was another running back taken in the 1st round who wasn't signed, so we went ahead and picked him up. Drew Brees was still available going into the season, and despite the fans wanting him, Coach Billick stayed true to Cross. Week 1 would feature Dre Bly intercepting his old team 3 times, showing everybody that he's still got it. But we would drop our first game of the year the next week, where San Francisco held off our late comeback attempt. After a nice win against Minnesota, we had our first matchup between Orlando Cross and Shannon Pleasant. The third-year quarterbacks battled back and forth, with Cross and the Vipers taking it. A couple of wins later, and we were 5-1, and the big names in free agency were finally getting signed, with us picking up Edgerrin James and Jacksonville bringing in Drew Brees. The Saints seemed like they were doing fine without Drew Brees, though, as they were 5-1, but by the end of this one, it was clear which team was better. By mid-season, we were 7-1, but we struggled with the 3-win Cardinals. After a classic back-and-forth shootout, Anquan Bolden would get them into field goal range, and they would give us our 2nd loss of the year. The next week was a potential Super Bowl preview, with 2 7-2 teams facing off, and Peyton Manning treated it like it was the big game. We played the other Manning the next week on Monday Night Football. The Vipers got the win, but at the cost of Charles Phillips suffering a broken hand and being out for the next 7 weeks. A week later, we played Seattle, who was having a down year, but they were still a talented team, and they showed it to us in this one. Cross would suffer a sprained elbow against Tennessee, putting him on the sideline for this one and next week. Luckily, Josh McCown is one of the best backups in the league, and he was able to lead us to victory. Next, we had a Monday night game with huge playoff implications against Green Bay, but without Cross, this offense was missing something. But even with that loss, we still clinched our division, and we dominated the Chicago Bears the next week. Our next game was against Jacksonville, and while Brees played well, Orlando Cross mixed some insane throws that you're not going to see any other quarterback make, and we got the win. Orlando Cross finished the 2009 season with over 3,000 yards, 29 touchdowns, and 12 picks. He was also our leading rusher, a yard shy of 700. He also had 5 rushing scores. Chris Clark had an impressive rookie season with over 700 yards and 9 touchdowns. Our defense balled out too, with rookie Antrell Wilson racking up a franchise record 13 sacks, along with Ike Taylor and Dre Bly having 5 picks each. And John Hall only missed 1 field goal all season, and that won him the best kicker award. Orlando Cross just missed out on the MVP. Instead, LaDainian Tomlinson won his 2nd. For the first time in franchise history, the Albuquerque Vipers were hosting a playoff game, and the fans were going wild. But it started off on a bad note, with Orlando Cross suffering a concussion, keeping him out of the rest of the postseason. We weren't able to dominate the Bears like we did a few weeks earlier, but we were able to hold on for the victory. In the divisional round, we played the Atlanta Falcons, and Josh McCown led us to a huge upset victory. The Vipers were a game away from the Super Bowl now, but we had to get past Green Bay on a snowy night. We stuck with him until McCown went down, and former starter Dave Douglas couldn't lead us to a win. The previous 3 Super Bowl losers were now in the big game, and that meant one of them had to win it, and this time Peyton Manning actually played like a star NFL quarterback, and he finally got himself a ring. Glenn Nash hung up the cleats going into 2010, but he will always be remembered as the first Vipers legend. We made some key re-signings, bringing back Cooper Carlisle, Jeff Earlbrick, and Tommy Pauly, but we did choose to let Dre Bly and Josh McCown hit the open market, as Bly was 33 and McCown wanted to be a starter. We also lost Jordan Babineau, Michael Bennett, and Drew Bennett. So with us losing so many players, you know we had to make some big signings, and we brought in the legend himself, Larry Fitzgerald. We also upgraded our defense with Ben Taylor and Terrence Newman, and we got some good depth with Seneca Wallace, Roddy White, Owen Daniels, and Maurice Jones-Drew. It was a big free agency class for quarterbacks, with Carson Palmer taking Eli Manning's job with the Giants and Eli switching New York teams. It looked like the Jets were going all in too, as they gave Eli Manning, Steve Smith, and Jason Witten as targets. The Packers got Larry Johnson, and the reigning MVP signed with Pittsburgh. There were also a lot of other key signings, but we're not going to have the time to cover all those in this video. We spent our first 3 draft picks on defense, including safety Wade Schmidt and linebacker Rocco Elliott. As for the players we let walk, Josh McCown got himself a starting job in Kansas City, Drew Bennett is now a Patriot, Jordan Babineau's with the Cardinals, and Dre Bly signed with the Bengals. We dominated our division for the first 3 weeks of the 2010 season, with Larry Fitzgerald scoring a touchdown in all 3 games. In week 4, we played the Atlanta Falcons, but they were without Michael Vick, so we dominated them. The Oakland Raiders somehow managed to keep it close with us, but we were able to hold on and advance to 5-0. But no matter how good or bad these teams are, it always seems to be a classic when the Vipers play in Arizona. We battled back and forth with the Cardinals, and at the end of the game, dove for the end zone but lost the football, and we suffered our first loss. The next week we had what could have been last year's Super Bowl, as both us and the Chargers lost our respective conference championship games, and we resumed to dominating teams, beating them by 13. We had a big game inside our division on Monday Night Football, and this looked like the Seahawks of old. We scored some garbage time points, but the Seahawks had their way with us. Since their meeting in 2007, Duncan Koch and Orlando Cross had taken very different paths. While Cross was getting better every year, Koch looked like he was getting worse, and the Vipers were back to dominating teams. The following week, we had a huge game against Green Bay, a game that could determine the top seed in the NFC. For the first time, the Packers were in our place, and Ike Taylor showed them who's boss, intercepting Aaron Rodgers 4 times, including 2 pick sixes, leading us to a 55-24 win. Josh McCown got himself a starting job with Kansas City in the offseason, but without all the great talent of the Vipers around him, he was struggling and unable to get his revenge against us. After beating the Giants, we had a big game against the Saints, and it did not start off well for us, turning the ball over 5 times, which led to us being down by 18 in the 4th quarter. Facing a 4th and 42, we had to go for it, Cross letting it fly to the end zone, and somehow it was caught by Roddy White. Then Terrence Newman came up clutch with a pick 6, and somehow this was a 1-score game. On our final drive, Cross found Alex Smith in the end zone for the win, in what I still call to this day the greatest game in franchise history. We continued the winning streak, and it all came down to week 17 against Seattle for the division. And this game was everything you thought it would be, with both teams exchanging scores back and forth. After Matt Hasselbeck made it a 1-score game, Dante Hall took matters into his own hands, putting the game on ice and locking up the 1 seed. We finished the season 14-2, and a big part of that had to do with the play of Orlando Cross, who threw 32 touchdowns and won the league MVP. But I'm not even sure that he was the best quarterback this season, as rookie Brock Flowers literally turned around the entire Redskins organization. His 34 touchdowns led the league and set a rookie record, and he got them to the playoffs for the first time in years. He wasn't the only one breaking records, though. Javon Curse set the sack record with 24. We were still struggling to run the football, though, with second-year running back Ed Ailman leading us with 676 yards. But our receivers did not disappoint. Larry Fitzgerald had over 1,300 yards and 13 touchdowns in his first season with us, winning the Best Wide Receiver award, and Charles Phillips is a great number 2 receiver to have. On the defensive side of things, 2 of our linemen had double-digit sacks, and the duo of Terrence Newman and Ike Taylor had a staggering 15 interceptions. John Hall had a perfect season kicking, and once again he won the Best Kicker award. In the divisional round, we had a rematch against the Saints, but we had no need for a big comeback this time as we rolled past them to the NFC Championship game. But in our way was the rookie sensation, Brock Flowers. But this turned out to be too much for the young gun as we had a 28-point lead at halftime and never looked back. So now in just 5 seasons, we had gone from the laughingstock of the NFL to the Super Bowl, but our opponents were very well experienced in this area, having won their 5th Super Bowl just 6 years ago. But again, the Vipers were too much for their opponents, even for the veterans, and we claimed our first Super Bowl championship 38-10. Now it was time to look for a repeat, and that started with us keeping key talent such as Ike Taylor, Charles Phillips, and Tariq Glenn, who all got new contracts. We didn't bring back everybody though, as Matt Lear, Roddy White, and James Hall all became free agents. Our rushing attack hasn't been much for the last few years, so we brought in both Cadillac Williams and Tatum Bell to boost it, and another former Buck in Simeon Rice for defense. And if you thought last year's free agency was wild, you better buckle up, because now we're going to have to play Tom Brady twice a year. Replacing him in New England is Peyton Manning of all people. Meanwhile, Matt Hasselbeck is out of the division as he signs with the Saints, but Matt Leinart stays in the division, going up to Seattle to replace Hasselbeck. Vince Young is now a Cowboy, and Byron Leftwich is a Bill. The Steelers and Lions stacked up on wide receivers, and Detroit wasn't done there as they got some huge names for their defense. With us signing 2 key running backs, we couldn't keep everybody around, so after just 2 years, Ed Ailman is going to be traded to the Baltimore Ravens. And we weren't done with the trades there, as we found out Ben Taylor doesn't really fit our defensive scheme, so we're going to send him to the Jets in exchange for a left guard. We once again went defense early in the draft, and we may have found a gem in the 4th round in Jamarcus Ward with his 99 speed. We also got some good depth at tight end, and Mr. Irrelevant is fullback Ron White. But our repeat chances took a blow in the preseason as Orlando Cross suffered a fractured foot, and he would miss the entire 2011 season. Despite not having the reigning MVP, this team was still very talented, and all Seneca Wallace really had to do was be a game manager. Cross's absence was definitely noticed on Sunday Night Football against the Saints, a game the Vipers lost 10-6. The 49ers would give us our 2nd straight loss, and we brought in another quarterback just in case. But 3 wins later, we were getting back on track and starting to feel good. In Week 7, we played Tom Brady's Cardinals for the first time. Unfortunately, we didn't get to see a Cross versus Brady game, and we would have to wait until next year before either quarterback would play another game, as Brady suffered a severe concussion that knocked him out for the year. So in what became a battle of backup quarterbacks, we got a huge win inside the division. With Cross out of the lineup, we weren't scoring as much, but the defense stood strong and kept games close, and Seneca Wallace did enough to make it an 8-game winning streak going into our game against Green Bay. But it's tough to win a lot of close games, and the Packers beat us in another low-scoring affair. 2 weeks later, we had a Super Bowl rematch. Pittsburgh thought they could get some revenge on us with Cross not playing, but they were mistaken, as our defense kept them out of the end zone, and Charles Phillips scored a 95-yard touchdown, which remains the longest play in franchise history. So even without our MVP quarterback, we still managed to go 13-3 and get a 1st round bye. Seneca Wallace was serviceable, throwing 24 touchdowns to 15 interceptions, but with him throwing for less than 3,000 yards, none of our receivers were able to break the 1,000-yard mark. But a big part of that was because for the first time in a while, we actually had a ground attack, with Cadillac Williams becoming our 2nd 1,000-yard rusher. Our defense was the foundation of the team this year though, allowing just 14 points per game and putting up some great numbers. Reggie Bush won the MVP, and it was well deserved as he ran for over 2,200 yards and 18 touchdowns. In the divisional round, we hosted the Atlanta Falcons, a team that we were really starting to build a rivalry with. We played the same kind of football we had all year, but Seneca Wallace threw 3 key interceptions, which cost us the game. Super Bowl 46 featured 2 teams that had never been to the big game before, the Houston Texans and New Orleans Saints. Unfortunately for Houston, Shannon Pleasant would miss a majority of the game with a chest injury. While JP Lossman and the defense were able to keep it close, the Saints were the one bringing home their first Lombardi trophy. When it came to re-signings in the offseason, Coach Billick made an interesting decision in letting Antrell Wilson become a free agent. Wilson had 35 sacks in his 3 years with the Vipers, so this was really a head-scratching move. We also let Chris Clark walk, but he had really fallen off after his rookie season, and we wanted to get Jamarcus Ward some more snaps. Tariq Glenn was holding out for a new contract, so we gave it to him. We also re-signed the leader of our defense, defense Jeff Earlbrick and star defensive tackle Daryl Fannin to a 5-year deal. We didn't re-sign Phil Van Dyke, Alex Smith, Dante Hall, Terrence Newman, or Jordan Gross, so those would be some key positions to fill in free agency and the draft. We got our right tackle replacement in Maurice Williams, but the rest of free agency was pretty much just depth. Pittsburgh was done with Big Ben, so now he's with the Colts, replaced by Donovan McNabb in Pittsburgh. Michael Vick signed with the Jacksonville Jaguars, and his replacement was Drew Brees. Carson Palmer signed with the Lions, and John Owens left Seattle for Chicago. The Packers, the Bills, and the Bears all signed some big names at wide receiver, and Jeremy Shockey was joining our division. As for our former players, Phil Van Dyke is now a Brown, Alex Smith a Steeler, Jordan Gross a Charger, Antrell Wilson a Jaguar, and Terrence Newman a Seahawk. And with the Eagles losing Donovan McNabb, they didn't have a replacement for him yet, so we sent them Seneca Wallace. In the first round, we selected tight end Vaughn Lewis, and we got corner Randall Slater in the second round. We also got running back Kirk Figgins late in the draft. Then the second wave of free agency came around, and it mostly consisted of backups, including Alex Smith, the quarterback, not the tight end. To kick off 2012, we had to play the defending Super Bowl champions. This game could have playoff implications for the end of the season, so us winning this game was huge. Our next 3 games were against NFC North opponents, and our offense was running like a well-oiled machine. Week 6 was a chance for Seneca Wallace to get a little bit of revenge against us. Unfortunately, he couldn't finish out the game, and we annihilated them after that. Once again, Tom Brady wasn't healthy for the Cardinals, which led to us advancing to 6-0. But his replacement in New England, Peyton Manning, hadn't suffered any injuries yet. He was playing just fine. After a back and forth battle though, we remained undefeated. We won a couple more division games and we were officially off to our best start in franchise history. But in week 11, we would face one of our toughest opponents. In another shootout with playoff implications, Aaron Rodgers, Larry Johnson, and the Packers gave us our first loss. Expectations were high for the Jets a few years ago, but they had yet to live up to them. Eli Manning and company kept it close, but we were able to get back into the win column. Monday night games against Seattle always seem to be classics, and this one was no different. After a mostly dull first half, the final 2 minutes were wild, with each team getting big plays for touchdowns. Luckily, our defense only gave up 3 more points after that, and we advanced to 11-1. We suffered a classic trap game against San Francisco before traveling to Orchard Park. And similar to when we played the Bills 4 years ago, Cross suffered an injury that sidelined him for the next 4 weeks. But even without him, we were still able to win by 35. Finally, we got to play a healthy Tom Brady. He carried the Cardinals offense, but every time he did something, so did Cadillac Williams. The two dueled back and forth, with Brady throwing 5 touchdowns and Williams running for 4. But in the end, Arizona would take it. That put a lot more pressure on our Week 17 game against Miami. If we win, we got ourselves a first-round bye and Cross had time to get back. But if not, things could get ugly in the wild card. Even though the Dolphins weren't very good, they managed to tie the game up late in the 4th. We nearly took the lead on a bomb to Jamarcus Ward, but it turns out he's just an MVS clone. Despite his mistake, we were still able to get into field goal range, and John Hall gave us our first-round bye. Orlando Cross had a career year, leading the league in touchdowns while only throwing 4 picks, and that won him his second MVP. Cadillac Williams averaged over 5 yards per carry and scored a total of 14 times, along with Larry Fitzgerald and Charles Phillips both going for over 1,000 yards, and Fitzgerald winning the Best Receiver award. Daryl Fannin also had a career year, and rookie Randall Slater had 4 interceptions. Cross was back for the playoffs, and we were going to need him against Atlanta. Drew Brees had really turned his career around with the Falcons, but it was Willis McGahee who was really giving us issues. Our offense played well, but Atlanta just wouldn't go away. With under 2 minutes to go, Atlanta was down by just 3 points and had a chance to put together a game-winning drive. But on 4th and inches, they called a design run for Drew Brees that didn't work, and that would be how their season ended. We were just a game away from the Super Bowl once again, but we had to get past the Packers, which is easier said than done. After throwing only 4 interceptions all year long, Cross threw 3 against Green Bay, and we fell short. Aaron Rodgers was back in the Super Bowl, and this time he really wanted to win. The Browns came into this game 15-1, but no one really thought they were as good as their record, and the Packers exposed them, winning 36-10 and bringing the Lombardi Trophy back home. To start year 8, a lot of big names retired, such as Peyton Manning, Matt Hasselbeck, Donovan McNabb, and Carson Palmer due to injury, who was unfortunately not the only Lion forced into retirement. Some notable non-quarterbacks retiring include 2-time MVP LaDainian Tomlinson and Champ Bailey. Coming off the best year of his career, we re-signed 2-time MVP Orlando Cross to a 5-year deal, making him the highest paid quarterback in the league. Chris Diamond is one of the best centers in football, and he wanted to be paid like it, so we gave him his money. Larry Fitzgerald and John Hall also got extensions, and Daryl Fannin got a new contract that made him the highest paid defender in football. We beefed up our defense in free agency with Alex Brown and Asante Samuel, and got a new backup quarterback in Ray Dawkins. 2013 was another big quarterback free agency class, with Eli Manning signing with the Texans, Shannon Pleasant with the rival Titans, and Phillip Rivers with the Jets. Again, we drafted defense early, bringing in a couple of linebackers and a defensive end with our first 3 picks. Finally, in the offseason, we needed a solid returner, so we signed Jerome Mathis onto the roster, even though he hadn't played in a few years. For a third time, we played Week 1 in New Orleans, and we were really starting to build a rivalry with them. The defenses kept this game close, and once again, we started off 1-0 against the Saints. In Week 2, we had a rainy game against Michael Vick's Jaguars. The conditions made it tough to hold on to the football, and it played a big part in our victory. Our home opener was against Eli Manning and the Houston Texans, and Orlando Cross's near perfect play led us to a win over one of the AFC's best. Once again, we faced Seattle on Monday Night Football, and it was yet another classic, but unfortunately, Seattle got the win. Continuing inside the division, Tom Brady and the Cardinals still had yet to live up to the hype, and that trend kept on going as we beat them. And just like that, we were back on Monday Night Football, this time against the Atlanta Falcons, our biggest rivalry outside of our division. Again, we lost in primetime as Drew Brees came up clutch on 4th down. Coming off of our bye, we were looking to bounce back against Ben Roethlisberger's Colts, and we pulled out some trickery for this one, throwing it to Daryl Fannin on the goal line for 6, and finally pulling off an end-around run with Charles Phillips after years of failing at that play. Tony Freeman was the first overall pick for the Carolina Panthers last year, and he might just turn this franchise around. With the help of his defense and his great play, Carolina pulled off a big upset. After a win over San Francisco, we traveled to Lambeau for a tough game against Green Bay. We captured all the momentum with former Packer Asante Samuel picking off the screen for 6, and we never looked back from there. Week 12 featured Cross versus Pleasant, Part 2, and even though Tennessee had a worse record than us, Shannon Pleasant got himself a win over Cross. We had a huge game against Seattle the following week, and after battling back and forth, John Hall gave us the win with no time left on the clock. We beat up on the Niners again, but Vince Young's Cowboys were too much for us to handle, and they gave us our 5th loss of the season. And the losing continued in Week 16, which made the final week of the season a win-or-go-home situation for Albuquerque. Luckily for us, Tampa Bay wasn't having a great season, and we won comfortably. Orlando Cross had another good season, Cadillac Williams killed it on the ground, and the duo of Fitzgerald and Phillips remained one of the best in the NFL. Our biggest weakness this season was our defense. We had a tough time getting to the quarterback, and even though Ike Taylor had 5 picks, he also gave up a lot of big plays. No back-to-back MVPs for Orlando Cross though, as Phillip Rivers had a great year with the Jets going 15-1. We had to go back to Lambeau Field in the wild card round where we had yet to win in the playoffs. But that all changed after Cadillac Williams iced the game with just a minute left to go to send us to Washington. Our offense struggled in the first half against the Redskins, but our defense held them to 5 field goals, which kept us in it. We ended up going into overtime at 25 apiece, but unfortunately, we couldn't do anything in the extra period, and Washington got the walk-off win. Super Bowl 48 featured those Redskins against the Houston Texans, and even though Lawrence Vickers was able to recreate John Riggins' Super Bowl touchdown run, it wasn't enough, and the Houston Texans won their first Super Bowl. Tom Brady actually retired for real going into the 2014 season. The leader of our defense also retired, leaving a void in the middle of the field. We brought back Joseph Santiago, Jamarcus Ward, and Trey Francis as restricted free agents, and we also re-signed stars such as John Kelly and Tariq Glenn. We decided to let Cadillac Williams walk, as we'd rather move on from him a year too early than a year too late. We lost key defensive pieces also, letting Rocco Elliott, Ike Taylor, and Wade Schmidt all hit the open market. We brought in some defensive stars in free agency, Jesse Baker, who only has 1 season without double-digit sacks, and Bernard Bailey should be a good complement to Daryl Fannin. Free agency wasn't as wild this year, but now we're going to have to play Vince Young twice a season. Former MVP Reggie Bush signed with the Colts, and Cadillac Williams is staying inside the division. The Colts also signed Anquan Bolden, and it looked like they were building something special. Our former DBs both signed in the NFC South, and Troy Polamalu is now a Cleveland Brown. We spent our first round pick on cornerback Derek Aaron Gordon, who will be thrown right into the starting lineup. We also signed Daniel Manning to be our starting safety. The 49ers, Steelers, and Bears all drafted quarterbacks in the first round, and all of them look like they could be pretty good. Our season opened against the fastest team in football, the Seattle Seahawks. It was a high-scoring game in Vince Young's debut, but we were the ones with the victory. Once again, we played the Saints early on in the season, and they were looking to make this rivalry not so one-sided. Denver came to town the following week, and again, our defense gave up over 40 points, and our offense couldn't keep up. Sunday Night Football felt like an early must-win game for both the Vipers and the Bears, and they became the third team in a row now to put up over 40 on us. Seattle hadn't lost since we beat them in week 1, and we hadn't won since then either. But our defense only gave up 17 points this game, and we stopped the losing streak. The defense continued to improve against New York, and we were getting back to our winning ways. The Albuquerque Vipers were really starting to feel like themselves, taking down Washington in prime time. Things got a little scary against the 1-7 Cardinals, with no-name quarterback Jim Middleton giving them a late lead, but thanks to the heroics of the Vipers quarterbacks, we held off the upset. Orlando Cross got hurt early in our game against Philadelphia, but backup Ray Dawkins led a comeback for the win to keep the winning streak alive. Oakland played us closer than we expected them to the next week, but Charles Phillips had a huge game, and we kept on winning. For the first time in Albuquerque Vipers history, it looked like the 49ers were good. Cadillac Williams scored against us, and San Francisco's offense was on fire. Luckily, so was ours. And in overtime, at 41 apiece, John Hall gave us the victory. Cross would suffer another injury in our game against Kansas City, and former Chiefs quarterback Ray Dawkins must have thought he was still playing for them because he kept throwing in the ball, and this ended our winning streak. Dawkins had to start against the Cowboys on Sunday night, but he actually played like an NFL quarterback this time, throwing 4 touchdowns in the win. We had another overtime game against San Francisco, and Dawkins stepped up in overtime for yet another victory. We had a shot at getting the top seed going into week 17, but now Ray Dawkins was playing like he was on the Chiefs again, and San Diego got the upset. But despite the loss, 11-5 was still good enough for the 1 seed. Even though he missed several games this season, Orlando Cross still led the league in touchdowns. Our ground game was definitely struggling without Cadillac Williams though. Phillips and Fitzgerald were still hands down the best receiving duo in the league, being voted 1 and 2 for the best wide receiver award. Bernard Bailey led us in sacks in his first year here, and Darren Gordon stepped up big time as a rookie. Vince Young just barely beat out Orlando Cross for the MVP, but he did run for over 1,000 yards. Orlando Cross was healthy for our playoff game, which was once again against the Atlanta Falcons. This ended up being much more one-sided than usual, and we were again a game away from the Super Bowl. The Packers had already defeated us a few times in the NFC title game, but this time it was at our place. It was a back-and-forth battle. Again, Cross struggled with turnovers, but in overtime, John Hall sent us to Super Bowl 49, where we played the New England Patriots. New England's defense played our receivers tough, forcing several drops due to big hits. Orlando Cross had a chance at a game-winning drive, but didn't see Von Lewis wide open on 3rd down. After that sack, it was 4th and long, and Cross came up just a single yard shy, and the Patriots won their 5th Super Bowl. We lost our offensive coordinator in the offseason, so we brought in Kurt Warner to fill that role after 3 disappointing years in Minnesota. We also signed Simeon Rice to be our defensive coordinator, who spent the 2011 season with us. Drew Brees, Steve Smith, and Brian Urlacher were all calling it quits. Our team lost Tariq Glenn and John Hall due to retirement as well, and former Vipers Ike Taylor and Terrence Newman joined them in retirement. We were planning on re-signing Randall Slater as a restricted free agent, but when we saw that the compensation pick for him was 3rd overall, we decided to let him go to Arizona. Even though Jamarcus Ward has been up and down for us, we chose to keep him around on a 3-year deal, and we also extended Charles Phillips for 3 more years. Asante Samuel was voted to the Pro Bowl and made some big plays for us this year, but he also got cooked a lot, so we let him walk. In free agency, we got our John Hall replacement in Brian Koch and our Tariq Glenn replacement in Joey Hand. It was time for another big quarterback free agency class, and it started with Aaron Rodgers signing with Indianapolis and Big Ben leaving there to replace the reigning MVP in Seattle. Matt Leinart signed with the Saints, John Owens with the Falcons, Byron Leftwich with the Cowboys, and Michael Vick with the Lions. Lee Evans returned to Buffalo, and Andre Johnson signed with Pittsburgh. Jason Witten replaced Vernon Davis in San Francisco, and our former pass rusher Antrell Wilson signed with the Bears. With the 3rd overall pick that we got forgot, we drafted running back Jake Gordon, and we grabbed corner Justin Williams late in the first. 2015 started against the Dallas Cowboys, and Byron Leftwich took a beating in his first game there. Albuquerque looked like they hadn't missed a beat and started the season 1-0. We hosted Michael Vick's Lions in our home opener, and we won what became a defensive battle. The 49ers had also started off the season 2-0. Unfortunately, Orlando Cross couldn't come up clutch at the end of the game against them, and we suffered our first loss of the season. Green Bay was now without Aaron Rodgers, but they seemed to be doing just fine with Ken Dorsey under center. Charles Phillips suffered a torn pec in this game, sidelining him for the next 10 weeks. And in back-to-back games now, Orlando Cross was unable to lead a game-winning drive. Our game against the winless Baltimore Ravens looked to be a good way to stop our 2-game losing streak, but Phil Van Dyke wouldn't stop scoring, and our losing continued in overtime. We had to beat the Cardinals the next week, otherwise we would fall to the bottom of our division. It didn't start off well though, as we lost Orlando Cross for the game, but it was the defense that really struggled in this one, giving up 4 Jim Middleton touchdowns, and we fell to 2-4. The Seattle Seahawks came to town on Monday Night Football, and receiver Brian Jackson was borderline unstoppable, going for 268 yards and 3 touchdowns. Big Ben suffered a dislocated shoulder late in the game, which would keep him out for the next 8 weeks. Again, we went into overtime, and the losing streak was finally over. We followed up that win by breaking records against the winless Vikings, a team that once beat us 72-3. Orlando Cross threw an astounding 8 touchdowns, rushing for another, and we won 63-38. We got revenge on Arizona a week later, and then had a big game against the division-leading 49ers. We jumped out to a 28-0 lead, but San Francisco scored 21 straight to make it close, but the defense stepped up in the end. And now we were really getting things rolling, putting up 51 on the Browns and 49 on the Seahawks. Cincinnati slowed us down a little bit, but the defense stepped up big time in the fourth quarter. Then we had what could possibly be our toughest opponent yet, the 11-2 Pittsburgh Steelers. Or at least that's what we thought, but apparently the Steelers didn't show up, and we played our most complete game possibly ever, dominating 41-6. But then for whatever reason, we didn't show up against Atlanta, managing to turn the ball over 6 times. Despite that, our defense played spectacular, and 2 touchdowns later, we were all tied up at 18. We ended up going into overtime at 25 apiece, and it looked like we won it on the first play of overtime, except there was a heartbreaking holding penalty. Nevertheless, we were still able to get in a field goal range, and we won a thriller. It appeared that we had clinched a playoff spot going into week 17, so we took our foot off the gas a little bit against the Bears. The rain was pouring down and led to some sloppy football, and we turned the ball over another 6 times. The Bears got the win, and then all of a sudden, we were out of the playoffs at 11-5. Despite the disappointing end to our season, Orlando Cross did throw for nearly 4,600 yards and 38 touchdowns, both of which led the league, and he won his 3rd MVP. Jake Gordon ran for nearly 1,000 yards and scored 12 touchdowns, and Jamarcus Ward did a great job stepping in for Charles Phillips. Our 2 defensive tackles, not named Daryl Fannin, had a combined 22 sacks, leading to some in the building thinking that Fannin should be traded. Meanwhile, in the secondary, Justin Williams had 7 picks, which is huge, especially for a rookie. And Brian Koch still had yet to miss as a Viper, winning the Best Kicker award. Somehow the Packers managed to go 13-3 with Ken Dorsey at quarterback, and they played Aaron Rodgers' Colts in Super Bowl 50. Everyone was picking the Colts in a blowout victory, but it went the complete opposite way, with Aaron Rodgers doing his best Peyton Manning Super Bowl impression, throwing 4 picks and losing 30-6. Mike Vick and Seneca Wallace both called it a career going into 2016, and Ken Dorsey really went out on a high note. Cadillac Williams retired as a 49er, and our longtime punter Rodney Williams retired as well. We brought back Baron Cleveland as a restricted free agent. I was also happy to see that Brian Jackson wasn't going to be playing inside our division anymore. We went ahead and re-signed Chris Diamond and Larry Fitzgerald to new contracts, and Joey Hand, who was holding out. Cooper Carlisle was getting up there in age, so we decided to let him go, and Eugene Thomas hadn't really lived up to all the hype. We signed 2 defensive starters in free agency in linebacker Willie Delgado and safety Lamar James, the widest Lamar you're ever gonna see. Alex Malone left the Patriots and signed with the Texans. Shannon Pleasant is now in Washington. Eli Manning somehow winds up on the Chargers. Big Ben's a Packer. Brock Flowers is with the Bills, and for some reason the Bengals cut their first overall pick quarterback Benji Owens after just a single single season, he would eventually go on and sign with the Chargers. We drafted Derek Flanagan in the first round to be our new guard, and a couple of receivers who fell to us with our next 2 picks. In the second wave of free agency, we got ourselves a new punter and brought back some familiar faces in Jordan Babineau and Tom Lang. We opened up the season on Thursday Night Football against the 49ers. This game is exactly what everybody wanted to see to start off the season, with lots of points and action, and the Vipers got the win. The next week, we traveled across the country to play the Dolphins, and Paul Williams decided to have his breakout game against us, catching 4 touchdowns in the upset victory. Before our home opener against the New England Patriots, we made a trade for cornerback Maurice Sanders from the Oakland Raiders. This was a Super Bowl 49 rematch, but they were down at their 3rd string quarterback, and we took care of business. The Bears were winless going into week 4, and it almost looked like we felt bad for them the way we just kept giving them the football. Despite all the turnovers against Chicago again, we held them off for the win. We had another exciting game against San Francisco, and Daryl Fannon's late interception set up a huge Vipers W. Things weren't even close against Arizona, but then the turnovers became a problem again when we played the Giants, as Orlando Cross turned it over 5 times in an overtime loss. For the 3rd time in franchise history, we were playing the Buffalo Bills, and for the 3rd time in his career, Orlando Cross suffered an injury that would keep him out for the next 4 weeks. Fortunately, backup DeJon Beasley did just enough for us to get the win. Seattle was rocking with Vince Young again, but he was hurt going into this game, so this huge battle in the NFC West was led by 2 backup quarterbacks. After a DeJon Beasley injury, though, we were down to our 3rd string quarterback, Dunk DeKoch, and he played like a 3rd string quarterback, throwing 3 interceptions. But we were able to come back from being down 16 and got the overtime victory. Larry Fitzgerald had played his team 13 times before this game, but none was quite like this one, as he caught 4 of DeJon Beasley's 5 touchdowns in a blowout win. And DeJon Beasley wasn't going to be slowing down against Seattle, throwing 5 more touchdowns in another overtime victory, and it felt like there may be a quarterback controversy brewing. Despite Beasley's superb play, Cross got the start against Atlanta, but you could tell he wasn't at 100% as we lost by 19. Coach Billick stayed with Orlando Cross though, and this time he was playing like an MVP, throwing 3 touchdowns in a win against the Jets. In America's Game of the Week, we traveled to New Orleans, and we were clearly the better team. The Tampa Bay Buccaneers were rocking their throwback jerseys in Week 16, and they played like the 1976 Buccaneers as we shut them out 45-0. We dominated Carolina in Week 17 and secured ourselves the number 2 seed in the NFC. Orlando Cross had himself another great season, winning a 4th MVP. Jake Gordon was a tad disappointing in year 2 though, not quite breaking 1,000 yards and only scoring 6 times. But I think it's safe to say that we've got the best receiving core in the NFL, with 3 receivers going over 1,000 yards. Daryl Fannin apparently heard the trade rumors at the end of last year, and he silenced those this season, recording a franchise record 17 sacks. The playoffs started a little bumpy with Orlando Cross throwing 4 interceptions against the Redskins, but our defense was playing elite and only allowed 3 points. But we had to play better than that against Green Bay, and we did. After getting a strip sack fumble returned for over 90 yards for a touchdown, all the momentum was going our way and we dominated. Now all we had to do was get a lead in Super Bowl 51 and hold on to it, which is easier said than done. I kid you not, we were up 28-3 before Houston got themselves into the end zone. We kept our foot on the gas, but the Texans just wouldn't go away. What was once a 25-point lead ended up being just a 3-point victory, but it didn't matter because we were once again Super Bowl champions. And that takes us to today, going into the 2017 season.